They said her scream was unlike anything human, a piercing, metallic sound that echoed through the forbidden city as molten gold poured past her lips. When it was over, her body gleamed faintly in the torchlight, a grotesque statue of loyalty betrayed. History remembers her only as the concubine who betrayed the emperor, but no record tells us her name with certainty. Some call her Lady Zhen, others the golden ghost of the East Wing. What truly happened that night remains tangled in rumor and imperial censorship. But behind the legend of molten gold lies a deeper story about power, love, jealousy, and the fragile line between devotion and survival. If you want to explore the untold corners of history, the forbidden chambers, the silenced voices, the stories carved out of suffering, then subscribe, and let's step inside the palace where one woman's defiance melted into myth. She arrived before dawn. The palace was still wrapped in mist, the marble bridges glistening like bones beneath the first light. The gates opened without sound, and the girl who had once been called Yue stepped into a world that would erase her name. Her mother's last words still trembled in her mind: smile, bow, survive. But even that felt like another lifetime. The servants led her through the Vermilion Hall, past lines of eunuchs who moved like ghosts, their faces unreadable. Every step echoed too loud, each sound swallowed by the endless corridors of red lacquer and gold leaf. The air was heavy with incense and fear. The harem lay deep within the palace, a city of women who lived and died by the emperor's whims. No sunlight reached the inner chambers, only the filtered glow through silk curtains dyed with crushed petals. The smell was intoxicating: jasmine oil, sandalwood, and something metallic beneath it, like the scent of coins after rain. Yue was one among hundreds, chosen for her beauty and her silence. The older concubines studied her like merchants inspecting jade. Her skin too pale, her voice too soft, her eyes too bold. They whispered she was dangerous, that the emperor would notice her, and in the forbidden city to be noticed was a curse. That night, she bathed in petals that floated like tiny corpses across the water. The matrons taught her the rules of grace, how to lower her gaze, how to move her hands like flowing water, how to speak only when spoken to. They bound her thoughts tighter than her waist. The emperor does not need your words, one said. He needs your silence. Days became rituals, dawn prayers, music lessons, the endless choreography of obedience. Yue learned to paint, to dance, to play the pipa until her fingertips bled. The sound of it filled the courtyards, sad, delicate notes that trembled like trapped birds. Somewhere beyond the walls, the empire moved, wars raged, provinces burned. But inside, time was syrup thick. 1,000 women waited for a single glance that could lift or destroy them. Then one evening, the emperor came. No announcement, no drums, only the sudden hush as servants fell to their knees. Yue felt it before she saw him, the shift in air, the tremor of power entering the room. He was younger than she expected, his face smooth, expressionless. His robes shimmered like a storm cloud stitched with gold. He looked at her and the room ceased to exist. He asked her name. Her voice broke on the first syllable. He smiled, almost amused, and told her she played the pipa like someone who had lost everything. Then he left, that was all. A single sentence. Yet by morning her name was on every tongue in the harem. The empress's servants began to watch her. Her meals tasted different. The chief eunuch, old Gao with eyes like black stones, appeared wherever she went. The other women no longer spoke her name, but their silence carried its own weight. Yue understood she was no longer invisible. A week later, she was summoned to the emperor's private garden. The air smelled of plum blossoms and wet earth. He waited beneath the moonlight, a shadow wrapped in silk. They walked among the stones in silence until he asked her why she looked sad when she played. She told him the truth, that music meant nothing unless it carried sorrow. He laughed softly as if hearing something forbidden, and told her that sorrow was the only honest thing in the palace. That night, he asked her to play again, and again, until the sun rose over the eastern walls and the world turned gold. She was called Mei Fei now, the favored one. Her chambers were moved closer to his. Her robes were lined with pearls. Her hair was perfumed with the emperor's favorite scent. But every gift was a chain. She could feel the jealousy thickening in the air, the glances that lingered too long, the quiet footsteps that followed her after dark. Once, as she passed through the Hall of Eternal Harmony, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in a bronze mirror. For a moment she didn't recognize the woman staring back, painted face, empty eyes, lips fixed in a careful smile. Somewhere beneath the layers of silk, Yue was fading. At night, she dreamed of her village, of rice fields glinting under the sun, of wind that smelled like rain, of laughter that didn't have to be hidden. But when she woke, the scent of sandalwood filled her lungs again, and she realized there was no way back. The emperor visited her often, but his affection came in storm. Sometimes tender, sometimes cruel. He could hold her hand and speak of poetry, then the next moment order a servant flogged for spilling wine. His moods were the empire itself, vast, unpredictable, merciless. And yet she loved him, or thought she did. Maybe it was devotion. Maybe it was the illusion of safety. Or maybe it was the only way to survive, to love the hand that could destroy you. But even paradise has cracks. And the first appeared one spring evening, when Yue found a folded note beneath her pillow, inked in haste, perfumed faintly with plum. It said only, "Not everything that shines is gold." Her fingers trembled as she held it. The calligraphy was elegant, unfamiliar. A warning or a confession, she didn't know. Outside, the night dripped with the sound of rain. Inside, Yue realized the walls around her beauty were also her coffin. And somewhere in the palace, someone was already planning how to bury her alive inside her own reflection. It began with silence, the kind that seeps through walls, that replaces the sound of laughter, that makes even the wind afraid to speak. Yue, or Mei Fei as she was now known, had grown used to the rhythm of palace life, the soft rustle of silk, the bells that marked each hour, the scent of ink and sandalwood drifting from the emperor's study. But lately something had changed. The air felt heavier. Servants bowed lower but looked longer. The chief eunuch's footsteps echoed too often outside her chamber. At first she thought it was jealousy. The harem had always been a quiet battlefield, smiles as weapons, compliments as poison. But this was different. This was the kind of silence that came before a storm. One evening, while the emperor dined with his ministers, Yue sat by the open window, playing her pipa. The melody was low and mournful, a tune she once heard her father hum while repairing fishing nets. But in the courtyard below, a shadow moved, the faint shape of a man, cloaked and still, watching. When she leaned forward, he was gone. The next morning, the emperor summoned her. He sat beneath a canopy of jade silk, eyes ringed with fatigue. Scrolls and petitions lay scattered around him, each carrying the scent of bureaucracy and fear. When he looked at her, something in his gaze had hardened. "You've been restless," he said. His tone wasn't cruel, just tired. The voice of a man who commanded an empire but trusted no one. "I sleep lightly," she answered. He studied her a moment longer, then waved her closer. "I had a dream," he said. "A white crane landed on my shoulder and whispered that someone close to me would betray me." He smiled faintly. "Strange, isn't it? Dreams can feel truer than words." She bowed her head. "Dreams are warnings, Majesty, but they are not proof." He said nothing. But as she raised her eyes, she saw it, the doubt already taking root in his mind like frost creeping across glass. That night her servants were questioned. Her chambermaids were replaced. Every letter she wrote, every word she spoke was watched. Even the music she played began to sound suspicious. And then came the rumors. They said a court musician had been seen near her quarters, that he had once composed a melody she favored, and that in his eyes there lingered something more than duty. The story spread faster than fire on silk, whispered by eunuchs, embroidered by concubines, sharpened by envy. When Yue heard it, she laughed at first, a small, hopeless sound. But by the next morning, the musician had vanished, his quarters empty, his name erased from the registry. That was when the fear began to rot inside her. She tried to speak to the emperor to tell him the truth, but he was distant, absorbed in omens and wars, his affection turning brittle. When he did look at her, it was as though he were studying a painting for flaws. "Do you still dream of freedom?" he asked her once. "I dream only of you," she lied. He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Soon, she found herself confined to her quarters for her own safety. The palace's great halls were closed to her. The courtyards she once walked were now forbidden. Even the plum trees outside her window were pruned away, as if the sight of them was too dangerous. The days became endless. The walls seemed to close in, whispering her name. She heard footsteps outside her door at night, faint breathing through the lattice. Sometimes she thought she saw the musician's shadow again, just at the edge of the lantern light, and sometimes she thought it was only her guilt taking form. Then one night, as rain hammered the tiles, the chief eunuch Gao appeared. His robes were soaked, his expression carved in stone. He dismissed her servants and stood before her, holding a small lacquer box. "The emperor has questions," he said. She reached for the box, but he opened it before she could touch it. Inside lay a folded letter, the same letter she had once found beneath her pillow. Her blood turned to ice. "Do you recognize this? I found it." "I don't know who." "Careful," he said, his voice soft as a blade. "The Emperor believes it came from a traitor, perhaps even from you." Her throat tightened. "That's a lie. The Emperor dreams of betrayal," Gao murmured. "Dreams become orders, Mei Fei. Be cautious what truth you deny." When he left, she sat alone in the dark. The rain outside sounded like 1,000 whispered accusations. She wanted to scream, but the palace had taught her that noise was weakness. Days passed. No summons came, no explanation. Just silence. The servants avoided her eyes. Her food arrived cold. She knew what that meant. Someone was already writing her confession. One morning, she heard the drums. The sound rolled across the courtyards, deep, deliberate, the rhythm of judgment. From her window, she saw a group of guards escorting a figure in chains. His face hidden beneath a hood, his hands trembling. She didn't need to see his eyes to know who it was, the musician. They led him toward the punishment court, and then he was gone. That night, the Emperor visited her one last time. He came without guards, his robes unbuttoned, his expression strange, not anger, not sorrow, but something colder. He sat across from her in the dim light and said quietly, "You have brought shame to me." "I have done nothing," she whispered. "You played your song," he said, almost gently, and others heard it. She wanted to reach for him, to remind him of their nights under the plum trees, of laughter and poetry, of the promises he once made when no one was listening. But his eyes no longer saw her. They saw an idea, betrayal, defiance, the echo of his own fear reflected in her face. He rose slowly. "You will have time to reflect. The truth always reveals itself in silence." When he left, the chamber doors closed behind him with a sound like the ceiling of a tomb. Yue sank to her knees. The lanterns flickered. The scent of sandalwood thickened until she could barely breathe. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world was still. But in that stillness, she understood something terrible. The Emperor no longer saw her as a woman. She was a symbol now, a warning to others. And in the Forbidden City, symbols were not allowed to live. The day began with silence, and silence in the Forbidden City was never innocent. When Yue awoke, the light through her lattice screens was strange, too pale, too still. Her maids were gone. Even the ever-present eunuchs who patrolled the corridors had vanished. For a moment, she thought the Emperor had forgiven her, that the storm had passed. But forgiveness does not walk quietly. Forgiveness does not smell of iron and rain. 2 guards entered without bowing. They did not speak. They bound her wrists with red silk, the color of festivity, but also of blood, and led her through the long, empty halls. Her bare feet whispered against the cold marble as they passed the courtyard she once filled with music. The plum trees were stripped bare. Not a sound, not a bird. The palace had turned its face away. When they reached the hall of punishment, the air changed. It reeked of metal, ash, and fear. She saw the brazier before she saw the man beside it, a massive copper bowl set over coals, molten gold swirling inside like a living sun. The heat hit her like breath. Behind the brazier stood the chief eunuch Gao, his robes immaculate, his face calm. "The Emperor regrets," he said softly, "that it has come to this, but treason cannot be forgiven. Treason." She said, her voice barely a whisper. "You know the truth." He lowered his gaze. "Truth is decided by the throne, not by the accused." Then she saw him, the Emperor, seated upon a raised dais, half-shrouded in shadow. His crown tilted slightly, his expression unreadable. He did not look at her as a lover. He looked at her as a problem. She fell to her knees. "Majesty," she said, the word breaking. "I have served you faithfully. I have loved no one but you." Still, he did not answer. The guard stepped forward, gripping her shoulder. She struggled, but their hands were like stone. Her voice rose, desperate, raw, alive, the last sound of a woman trying to remind the world she existed. "You told me sorrow was the only honest thing in this palace. Was that a lie?" At that, he finally looked at her. For a moment, there was something human in his eyes, pain, doubt, maybe even regret, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Pour it," he said. The executioner moved slowly, reverently, as if performing a ritual rather than an act of cruelty. The ladle dipped into the molten gold, its surface rippling with reflected fire. The sound was low and alive, a hiss that seemed to breathe. Yue felt the heat on her face, her tears drying before they could fall. The guards held her chin up, forcing her eyes toward the Emperor. "Look at him," Gao whispered. "A loyal subject dies facing her ruler." She tried to speak, but her voice was gone. The ladle tilted. For a heartbeat, the world became light. A flash, a scream that cut through the air, sharp, metallic, inhuman. Those who witnessed it later said it didn't sound like pain. It sounded like a song torn apart. When it was over, the hall was silent again. The smell of gold and burned flesh clung to every surface. The executioner bowed. Gao bowed. The emperor stood. He looked at what remained of her, a body still glistening faintly, as though the gods had taken pity and turned her into something eternal. "Let no one speak her name again," he said, and then he left. But the thing about silence is that it doesn't erase sound, it only traps it. And that scream, that moment, never left the palace. Servants claim they heard it echo through the corridors at night, a faint ringing like distant metal. The emperor stopped sleeping. The mirrors in his chamber were covered. The plum trees died. Gao ordered her body removed before sunrise. The guards carried her through the gardens, past the ponds she once walked beside, and buried her in secret beyond the outer wall. No tombstone, no name, only a mound of disturbed earth beneath the shadow of a cypress tree. By morning, the court musicians played a new melody, one the emperor had commissioned himself. It was slow, sorrowful, written in the key of mourning. But to those who listened closely, there was something beneath the notes, something haunting. The rhythm of it matched the pace of her heartbeat in those final moments. A month passed. Then, too, the emperor began to dream again of gold, of fire, of a voice calling from the edge of the garden. He forbade molten metal anywhere near the palace. The brazier was dismantled, the executioner reassigned to distant provinces, yet the guilt lingered like smoke. One night when the moon was high and pale as bone, the emperor walked alone to the east wing, the place where Yue had once played her pipa. The room was empty now, stripped bare, but the air still smelled faintly of plum blossoms. He sat on the floor and waited, and in the silence he thought he heard it, a single note, soft and trembling, as if played from somewhere far away. A sound of sorrow that refused to die. He turned toward the sound, whispering her name for the first time since her death, but there was no one there. Only a golden shimmer in the corner of his eye, vanishing like a dream when he reached. By dawn, his hair had turned visibly grayer. Servants said he no longer spoke at meals, that he spent his nights wandering the gardens, muttering to himself, that when he looked at the gold in his own crown, he flinched as if it burned him. And though he forbade her name, the women of the harem whispered it anyway, Lady Yue, the golden concubine, the one who burned for love. No matter how deep the emperor buried her story, it lived on. In music, in nightmares, in the quiet moments between candlelight and dawn. Because the truth of her death wasn't just betrayal, it was fear, his fear made flesh. In the months that followed her execution, the palace seemed to lose its heartbeat. The courtyards that once hummed with whispers and music grew barren, the laughter of concubines replaced by the measured shuffle of guards. Even the birds avoided the eaves of the east wing. The scent of sandalwood still clung to the air, but beneath it was something heavier, the faint, metallic trace of death that no incense could disguise. The emperor withdrew from the world. He stopped attending court, leaving ministers to argue over matters of state while he lingered in the private garden, eyes fixed on the lotus pond where goldfish darted like fragments of fire. He no longer looked at his concubine. He no longer trusted anyone. He spoke less, ate little, and stared too long at the flames in the brazier, as if searching for something inside them. The servants learned to move silently around him. They said his shadow had grown longer, darker. Some nights he would awaken screaming, convinced molten gold was pouring down his throat. The palace doctors called it a fever of the mind, but those who had been there, those who had heard her scream, knew it was something else. Guilt that had turned to rot. And yet the emperor did not name it as such. Instead, he blamed the palace itself, the walls, the mirrors, the women. He ordered the east wing sealed, its doors nailed shut, its gardens razed. But strange things began to happen anyway. At dusk, the eunuchs claimed they heard faint music coming from behind the boarded doors, a pipa string plucked once, then silent. Guards posted outside swore they saw a woman's figure moving behind the silk screens, her hair black as ink, her face half-shimmering like molten metal. One man fainted. Another ran screaming into the courtyard, shouting that her mouth was still full of gold. They found him dead by morning, his skin pale, his eyes wide open. The emperor dismissed the stories as superstition, but his hands trembled when he signed the order. He moved his quarters deeper into the palace and banned all mention of music. Even the temple bells were muffled. The harem's laughter, once forced, now forbidden, dissolved into a kind of living silence. But silence only makes ghosts louder. The empress, who had long endured in the shadows of his obsession, began to notice the change in him. She saw how he lingered by the windows at night, how his eyes followed something invisible beyond the gardens. "You are haunted," she told him once, quietly. Turned to her, his face gaunt. "Haunted by whom?" "By the one you made beautiful in death," she said. "By the one you could not love without destroying." He said nothing. But that night the emperor burned her chambers too, every silk cushion, every tapestry, every trace of the woman he had loved. He believed if he erased the evidence, the ghost would vanish. Instead, it multiplied. Rumors spread that her spirit had attached itself to the palace gold. The coins used for offerings felt hot to the touch. The gilded dragons on the throne seemed to shimmer in the dark, their eyes glowing faintly when no candles burned. When a servant died suddenly after polishing the emperor's goblet, the court whispered that Yue's curse had reached him. The emperor's madness deepened. He ordered every trace of gold removed from his chambers, the ornaments, the inlays, even the embroidery on his robes. What could not be stripped was covered with lacquer or silk, but gold has a memory. It lingers in reflections, in dreams, in the pulse beneath the skin. Sometimes, late at night, he claimed to hear her voice, not screaming, whispering. "You poured me into eternity." The palace priests performed exorcism. Drums thundered, incense smoke filled the air, chants rolled through the halls for 7 nights. Still, the emperor woke drenched in sweat, certain that he had seen her standing at the edge of his bed. "She said nothing," he told Gao. "She only looked at me, and her eyes were not angry. Only sad." Gao, who had long since learned the art of obedience, said, "Your Majesty must forget." But even Gao could feel it, the weight pressing down on the palace like unseen hands. He began to wonder if the emperor had angered not only heaven but something older, something that fed on sorrow and memory. The years crawled by. The emperor aged faster than his time. His hair whitened, his skin turned ashen, and the empire he once ruled with iron precision began to splinter at its edges. Floods, famines, rebellions whispered in the south. The people said heaven had withdrawn its mandate, that the emperor's cruelty had poisoned the land. And in the court, they gave that poison a name, the Golden Ghost. It became legend that her spirit walked the corridors at night, brushing her fingers along the lacquered doors, leaving faint golden fingerprints that no servant could scrub away. Children born within the palace walls after her death were said to cry endlessly until removed from the east wing. 1,000 small signs, each one denied but none dismissed. Even the empress could not bear it. One night she confronted the emperor again. "She will never leave you," she said. "You killed her once, you must kill her again in your heart, or she will take the rest of you." The emperor only smiled, a fragile, broken smile. "Perhaps she already has." The following spring, he ordered a new pavilion built over the place where her body was buried. A temple, he said, dedicated to the goddess of mercy. But when the workers dug into the soil, they found something glittering beneath it, tiny flecks of gold mixed with ash. The workers fled. The project was abandoned. From that day forward, no one spoke of her again in public. But in the private quarters of the harem, the women still prayed to her, the concubines, the maids, the forgotten. They whispered her name before sleep, asking her spirit to protect them from the same fate. Because in that place of gilded silence, her story had become more than legend. It had become a warning of how love could become a weapon, how beauty could be both a gift and a curse, and how the power of men could turn devotion into death. And so, the palace endured a monument to her suffering, haunted not by her ghost alone, but by the memory of what the empire demanded from its women: obedience that glowed like gold, and silence that burned hotter than fire. Centuries passed. Dynasties rose and fell. The marble of the Forbidden City cracked under the weight of time, and yet the legend endured, whispered by palace guides, preserved in forbidden scrolls, embroidered into stories told by grandmothers to restless children. They called her Lady Yue, the golden concubine, the woman who drank fire. Some swore she was a warning from heaven. Others said she had become a goddess of vengeance, her spirit gilded with eternal sorrow. But history, for all its grandeur, has a way of distorting the truth. What we inherit are fragments, charred ink, censored poems, records deliberately rewritten. The official archives speak of a concubine executed for treason during the Ming era, but her name is redacted, replaced by a single character. Chinese letter, sin. No trial transcripts, no confession, no lineage. Only silence where a life once was. Still, traces remain in the margins of forgotten documents. A scribe's note about a favored woman who angered the Son of Heaven. A poem attributed to a court musician executed the same year, lamenting a voice that turned to gold. And somewhere in the ruins of the East Wing, an archaeologist once found a strand of hair fused to a lump of melted metal, blackened, yet glimmering faintly when struck by light. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. What endures in her story is not the act itself, but what it represents, the sickness of power disguised as divinity, the way love curdles when trapped inside hierarchy. Her death was not just punishment for betrayal. It was proof that even beauty could not exist unowned. Imagine her, centuries before the word feminine meant anything at all, standing in a world where her worth was measured by obedience. She was told to be graceful, silent, loyal, and when she failed to be invisible, she was consumed. Her sin was not betrayal, it was being seen. And yet her story did not vanish as the emperor commanded. It slipped through the cracks of the empire's control, carried by servants, echoed in the songs of peasants who never set foot within palace walls. Each retelling twisted her a little more. Some said she had plotted treason, others that she refused the emperor's touch, that she struck him in defiance, that she died laughing as the gold burned her throat. Truth blurred into myth, but the ache remained, because what people remembered wasn't her crime, it was her scream. Historians argue whether molten gold was ever truly used in execution. Some say it was metaphor, a punishment invented by rumor, meant to dazzle with horror. Others insist there are records of nobles in both East and West punished this way, a cruel irony reserved for those accused of greed. But whether literal or symbolic, the story speaks to something deeper than fact. It speaks to the human urge to make meaning out of suffering, to turn cruelty into spectacle, pain into prophecy. And perhaps that's why her death still lingers, because it mirrors the empire itself, glittering on the outside, hollow within. The emperor who condemned her outlived her by only 7 years. In his final months, he refused to touch gold of any kind. He wore robes dyed in gray, ate from porcelain bowls, and demanded that his attendants cover every trace of gilded ornament from his sight. When he died, his attendants found him sitting upright before a mirror, eyes open, mouth slightly parted, as though seeing something beautiful and terrible all at once. The chroniclers described his end with the usual ceremony. The Son of Heaven ascended to the realm of ancestors, his spirit pure, his reign luminous. But in secret, those who prepared his body whispered that his tongue was missing, burned away, they said, as if molten metal had claimed him too. After his death, the East Wing remained sealed for generations. Dust thickened over the marble floors. The golden dragons on the ceiling dimmed, their eyes dulled by neglect. But when moonlight slipped through the cracks, it touched something in the darkness, a faint reflection, a glimmer as if the air itself remembered. It said that during the Qing dynasty, an empress who renovated the palace ordered the wing reopened. The workers refused. They said when they tried to break the seal, they heard music, a low, trembling note like a string plucked underwater. The empress laughed and ordered them back to work. That night, the roof collapsed without warning, killing 3 men. She ordered the site resealed. It has remained that way ever since. So perhaps that's how myths survive, not in books or monuments, but in fear. Because fear keeps memory alive long after love is gone. Today, historians debate who she was. Some believe she was modeled after Lady Zhen of the Late Han, executed for her political influence. Others see traces of Yang Gaifai, whose beauty toppled an empire. But what if she was no one? What if she was every woman silenced, every life consumed by the machinery of power? The legend of molten gold is not about death at all, it's about transformation. The way a woman, stripped of name and voice, becomes something untouchable through suffering. Her body turned to gold, her story turned to myth, her silence turned to a roar that centuries could not smother. The palace is quiet now. The tourists walk through its courtyards with cameras and water bottle, unaware that their footsteps echo the same stones that once carried her to death. The walls are clean, the air still. But if you linger in the East Wing after sunset, when the last guide has gone and the cicadas begin their slow song, you might hear it, a single note from a pipa, soft as breath, fading into the night. And maybe, just maybe, if you listen closely enough, you'll catch her voice beneath it, not screaming, not weeping, but whispering the truth she was denied. That beauty is not obedience, that love is not possession, and that gold, for all its luster, can never purify guilt. History forgot her name. But time, patient as ash, remembers what gold tried to hide. And in that memory, she still lives, shining not from the gold that killed her, but from the courage to exist in a world determined to melt her down.